Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to mountainsides like forgotten prayers, stands a small white church that most locals pretend doesn't exist. Mount Calvary Baptist has occupied the same weathered plot of land since 1889, its modest steeple barely visible through the ancient oaks that seem to lean away from the building itself. For over a century, this congregation has maintained a terrible secret, one that transforms Sunday worship into something far darker than any sermon about damnation. Between 1912 and 2023, exactly 138 people vanished from the surrounding communities. Fathers who went hunting and never returned home, mothers who stepped out to gather herbs and disappeared into the mountain fog, children who wandered too far from their front porches and were swallowed by shadows that moved wrong in the fading daylight. Yet every single one of them received a proper Christian burial at Mount Calvary Baptist, complete with grieving families, tearful eulogies, and freshly carved headstones marking their final resting place. The problem is simple and horrifying. When authorities finally obtained court orders to exhume those graves in late 2023, they found nothing but empty wooden boxes, carefully weighted with stones to feel authentic when carried by pallbearers. 138 funerals for people who were never actually dead, conducted by a congregation that knew exactly where those missing souls had really gone. This isn't a story about a typical missing persons case. This is about a religious community that discovered something ancient sleeping beneath their mountain, something that demanded a very specific type of offering in exchange for protection and prosperity. For 11 decades, the families of Mount Calvary Baptist fed that hunger, one disappearance at a time, while maintaining the perfect facade of a grieving Christian community. The first hint something was wrong came from an insurance investigator in 2019. Margaret Chen was reviewing life insurance claims for Appalachian Mutual when she noticed an unusual pattern. Mount Calvary Baptist, a congregation of barely 60 families, had filed more death benefit claims than churches serving populations 10 times their size. Even more suspicious, nearly every claim involved someone who had allegedly died in a remote location where the body was never recovered. Hunting accidents in inaccessible ravines, drownings in flash floods that swept bodies downstream, heart attacks suffered while hiking alone in areas so treacherous that search and rescue teams couldn't safely operate. Margaret's initial investigation revealed something that should have been impossible. The death rate in the Mount Calvary Baptist community was statistically astronomical, yet the congregation never seemed to shrink. New members appeared regularly, often entire families who claimed to be distant relatives of existing parishioners. These newcomers always seemed to know remarkably little about their supposed family history, and they invariably settled into the community with an unsettling ease, as though they'd been coached on local customs and personalities. More troubling was the discovery that many of the alleged accident sites, where bodies were reportedly lost, had been visited by church members in the days immediately preceding each incident. Trail cameras maintained by the Forestry Service captured images of Mount Calvary parishioners hiking to remote locations, always in groups of 3 or 4, always carrying heavy canvas bags that appeared much lighter on their return trips. Margaret Chen submitted her findings to local law enforcement in early 2020, but her report disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. The sheriff's department claimed they'd investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The state police insisted the matter fell under federal jurisdiction. Federal authorities maintained it was a local issue. For 3 years, Margaret's evidence gathered dust while the pattern continued unchanged. What finally broke the case open wasn't law enforcement initiative, but a single photograph posted on social media. In March 2023, a hiking enthusiast named David Kowalski was exploring the remote areas around Mount Calvary when he stumbled upon what appeared to be a natural cave system. Excited by his discovery, he posted several images online, including one that showed unusual markings carved into the cave entrance. Within hours, his post had attracted the attention of amateur archaeologists and folklore enthusiasts who recognized the symbols as matching historical accounts of pre-Columbian ritual sites. The photograph went viral in academic circles, and within days, a team from the University of Kentucky had obtained permits to investigate the cave system. What they found defied rational explanation. The caves extended far deeper into the mountain than geological surveys indicated possible, with chambers carved from living rock using techniques that predated any known settlement in the region. More disturbing were the recent additions to these ancient spaces. The deepest accessible chamber contained what appeared to be a modern shrine, complete with electric lighting powered by a generator hidden in a side passage. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing people of all ages engaged in everyday activities: family barbecues, children's birthday parties, high school graduations, wedding celebrations. Every photograph featured individuals who had been reported missing from the Mount Calvary Baptist community over the past century. But these weren't memorial photographs. The people in these images were clearly alive, clearly happy, clearly participating in some form of ongoing community life. They showed signs of aging appropriate to the time that had passed since their disappearances. Children who had vanished in the 1950s appeared as elderly adults in recent photographs. Missing persons from the 1990s looked exactly as old as they should if they had continued living normal lives. The cave shrine also contained detailed records, meticulously maintained ledgers that documented every disappearance with bureaucratic precision. Names, dates, locations, and most chilling of all, detailed notes about the selection process. The records revealed that Mount Calvary Baptist operated according to a quota system. The quota had started small in 1912, just 2 people annually, but had steadily increased over the decades until it reached its current level of 12 to 15 disappearances per year. The selection process was horrifyingly systematic. Church leadership maintained detailed files on every community member, tracking their relationships, their likelihood to be missed if they vanished, and their potential value to the continuation project. Preference was given to individuals with few outside connections, those who could disappear without triggering extensive law enforcement investigations. Transients were particularly valuable, as were elderly people whose deaths could be easily attributed to natural causes. Most disturbing were the recruitment records. The ledgers detailed how Mount Calvary Baptist had spent decades identifying and cultivating relationships with vulnerable individuals from neighboring communities. People struggling with addiction, those facing financial ruin, individuals dealing with family breakdowns or legal troubles. Church members would approach these vulnerable souls, offering assistance, gradually drawing them into the Mount Calvary community, where they could be more easily monitored and eventually selected for disappearance. The university team immediately contacted federal authorities, but by the time FBI agents arrived at the cave site, the shrine had been completely dismantled. The photographs, the ledgers, the electrical equipment, everything had been removed with professional efficiency. Even more unsettling, the deeper passages that researchers had documented just days earlier were now blocked by cave-ins that geological experts insisted appeared natural despite their suspicious timing. This systematic destruction of evidence might have ended the investigation entirely if not for Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the lead archaeologist who had been careful to photograph everything before authorities arrived. Her documentation provided enough evidence for federal prosecutors to obtain warrants for a comprehensive investigation of Mount Calvary Baptist and its surrounding community. What they discovered was a conspiracy that spanned multiple generations and involved virtually every adult member of the congregation. The church's financial records revealed a complex web of insurance fraud, identity theft, and money laundering that had generated millions of dollars over the decades. Life insurance policies were systematically taken out on potential victims months before their disappearances. Social Security benefits continued to be collected for years after people vanished, with church members assuming their identities just long enough to maintain the financial flow. The congregation had also developed sophisticated methods for covering their tracks. They maintained detailed relationships with corrupt officials in the county clerk's office, the sheriff's department, and even the state vital records division. Death certificates were routinely falsified, burial permits were issued for empty coffins, and investigation reports were altered to minimize scrutiny of disappearances. But the financial crimes, shocking as they were, paled in comparison to the physical evidence that began emerging as the investigation expanded. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Mount Calvary Baptist Cemetery confirmed that every grave contained exactly what Margaret Chen's insurance investigation had suggested: empty coffins, carefully weighted to feel authentic, buried with full ceremony, while the actual individuals remained missing. The radar also revealed something else. Beneath the cemetery, approximately 20 feet below the oldest graves, lay a network of artificial chambers connected by narrow tunnels. These underground spaces appeared to be much older than the church itself, possibly predating European settlement in the region. More importantly, they were clearly still in use. The Mount Calvary Baptist Church had perfected their system over decades, but the selection process wasn't random. Hidden within the church basement, investigators discovered what appeared to be a meticulous filing system. Each missing person had a detailed profile documenting their family connections, financial status, and most disturbingly, their perceived value to the community. The files revealed a quota system that had operated with clockwork precision since 1912. Every year, the church leadership would convene in what they called the choosing ceremony. Former members who later fled the community described hushed meetings where names were read aloud from a leather-bound ledger. The criteria were chillingly practical. Priority targets included the elderly without family, drifters passing through town, and individuals struggling with addiction or mental illness. People's society had already begun to forget, but the system evolved over time. By the 1950s, the church had expanded their reach beyond the vulnerable. They began targeting individuals with substantial life insurance policies, orchestrating elaborate schemes to collect death benefits on people who were very much alive. The paper trail stretched across multiple states, involving corrupt insurance agents, complicit funeral directors, and even judges who signed death certificates without examining bodies. Martha Hensley worked as a secretary for the church from 1963 to 1967. In a deathbed confession recorded by her grandson in 1998, she revealed the administrative side of the operation. Each selected individual would be assigned a handler, usually a trusted church member, who would gradually isolate them from their remaining social connections. The process could take months or even years. The handlers would identify personal vulnerabilities, financial difficulties, family disputes, anything that could be exploited to make the person more dependent on the church community. Gradually, the target would be convinced to sign documents transferring property, naming the church as beneficiary on insurance policies, or even adopting new identities that would make their eventual disappearance less noticeable to outside authorities. What made the system particularly insidious was how it leveraged genuine community support. Many targets initially experienced real help from church members. Their bills would be paid, their homes repaired, their children looked after. This generosity created powerful emotional bonds and crushing psychological debt. When the time came for the final transaction, many victims went willingly, believing they were fulfilling a sacred obligation to their saviors. The underground network beneath Mount Calvary was far more extensive than initial investigations revealed. Ground-penetrating radar conducted in secret by federal agents mapped a labyrinth of tunnels stretching nearly 3 miles in multiple directions. The system connected to natural cave formations that had been modified and expanded over generations. Some passages were wide enough for vehicles, others barely large enough for a single person to crawl through. Within this subterranean community, the disappeared maintained a parallel society. The photographs found in the shrine showed people aging naturally, suggesting they lived full lives below ground. But what kind of lives were they living? What kept them from simply walking back to the surface and exposing the operation? According to intercepted communications between church leadership and outside contacts, the underground residents weren't prisoners in any conventional sense. They had been psychologically transformed through a process the church called spiritual rebirth. This involved months of isolation, intense religious indoctrination, and what former members described as ritualistic ceremonies designed to completely break down their previous identities. The missing weren't just hidden, they were recreated, given new names, new purposes, new beliefs that made their previous lives seem like sinful dreams they needed to forget. Many genuinely believed they had died and been resurrected into a higher form of existence. The surface world became something they viewed with fear and disgust, a realm of corruption they had been blessed to escape. This psychological control was reinforced by the cave environment itself. The constant darkness, the disorienting maze of passages, the complete dependence on church leaders for food and information created a form of sensory deprivation that made independent thought nearly impossible. Those who showed signs of resistance or desire to return to the surface were subjected to more intensive interventions. The church's financial operations were equally sophisticated. Over 11 decades, they had collected millions in fraudulent insurance claims, inherited properties, and donations from families grateful for the church's care of their loved ones during their final days. This money funded not just the underground expansion, but a network of legitimate businesses that provided cover for their activities. Mount Calvary owned construction companies that could excavate and build without drawing attention. They operated funeral homes in 3 states, allowing them to bury empty coffins with official documentation. They had partnerships with medical facilities that would provide death certificates and relationships with government officials who would process paperwork without asking difficult questions. The scope of corruption was breathtaking. County coroners, state bureaucrats, federal inspectors, all had been either bought or blackmailed into compliance. The church had created a shadow infrastructure that could make people disappear with legal documentation, official proceedings, and community sympathy for the grieving families left behind. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how the operation had evolved to serve a deeper purpose than mere financial gain. The missing persons weren't just sources of money or labor for underground construction projects. They were offerings to something the church leadership believed dwelt in the deepest parts of the cave system. Ancient symbols carved into the rock walls predated European settlement by centuries. Local Native American tribes had long considered the mountain sacred, but not in a positive sense. Their oral traditions spoke of a sleeping presence that demanded tribute in exchange for prosperity. The Cherokee word for the mountain translates roughly to where the hungry earth feeds. Early church records, written in a mixture of English and symbols that no linguist has successfully decoded, suggest the founders didn't create their underground operation arbitrarily. They were following instructions received through what they called divine communication, but which seemed to originate from somewhere deep within the mountain itself. The systematic nature of the disappearances, the specific numbers taken each year, the careful selection process, all appeared designed to satisfy some kind of supernatural appetite. The church leadership genuinely believed they were serving a higher power, one that rewarded their devotion with material prosperity and protection from outside interference. This belief system explained why the operation continued for over a century without significant internal resistance. Church members weren't just participating in an elaborate criminal conspiracy, they were fulfilling what they saw as a sacred covenant. The missing persons weren't victims, they were sacrificial offerings that ensured the survival and prosperity of the entire community. The investigation revealed that similar operations existed in other parts of Appalachia, all centered around churches or religious communities built near significant cave systems. Federal authorities identified at least 17 other locations where unexplained disappearances followed similar patterns. Each site showed evidence of extensive underground development, financial irregularities, and connections to local officials who seemed remarkably incurious about missing persons reports. The network appeared to communicate through coded messages in religious publications, sharing techniques and coordinating activities across state lines. What had seemed like an isolated phenomenon in one Kentucky mountain town was actually part of a much larger system that had been operating throughout the American South for generations. The true scope of the conspiracy may never be fully understood. Records were systematically destroyed, witnesses disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, and entire communities seemed to develop collective amnesia about events they had previously discussed openly. The few investigators who tried to piece together the full picture found themselves transferred to other assignments or encouraged to pursue early retirement. Today, Mount Calvary Baptist Church sits empty, its doors chained shut by federal order. The official explanation cites structural damage and environmental hazards, but locals know the real reason. On quiet nights, people claim to hear singing coming from beneath the mountain, voices harmonizing in melodies that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The cave entrances have been sealed with concrete and steel, but the underground passages remain largely unexplored. Whatever happened to the 138 people who disappeared over 11 decades, their fate remains locked in the darkness below. What authorities found when they finally breached the underground chambers beneath Mount Calvary Baptist Church challenged every assumption about what had really happened to those 138 missing souls. This wasn't just about empty coffins or financial fraud. The ledgers told a different story entirely, written in a careful hand that documented not deaths, but transformations. Not victims, but willing participants in something far more complex than anyone had imagined. The first chamber contained what investigators initially mistook for a primitive living space. Rough-hewn sleeping areas, a communal cooking pit, shelves carved directly into the stone walls. But the details revealed sophistication that defied explanation. Ventilation shafts that drew fresh air from unknown sources, a water system that channeled mountain springs through carved channels with mathematical precision, storage areas that maintained constant temperatures perfect for preserving food. Most unsettling were the personal belongings. Clothing from different decades hung on wooden pegs, family photographs in frames, some so old the faces had faded to shadows, children's toys carved from mountain wood, wedding rings arranged in neat rows on a natural stone shelf. These weren't the possessions of kidnapped victims. They were the carefully preserved memories of people who had chosen to leave their old lives behind. The second chamber served as what could only be described as a workshop. Tools lined the walls, some recognizable as standard farming implements, others crafted for purposes that remained unclear. Workbenches bore the marks of constant use. Half-finished projects suggested ongoing activity, furniture being carved, cloth being woven, metal being shaped into objects that served no obvious function. The quality of craftsmanship was extraordinary, displaying skills that would have taken decades to develop. But it was the third chamber that forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they understood about Mount Calvary Baptist Church. This space served as a library of sorts, though the books weren't bound in leather or cloth. Instead, knowledge was preserved on thin sheets of stone, covered in symbols that combined familiar English letters with markings that resembled no known language. The content, when partially decoded, revealed agricultural techniques, medicinal formulas, and detailed observations about seasonal patterns that spanned generations. One particularly detailed stone tablet contained what appeared to be a record of the underground community's development over time. Drought, disease, economic collapse, family feuds, all the hardships that plagued mountain communities in the late 1800s had driven these first residents to seek sanctuary beneath the earth. The community had grown slowly, accepting new members only after careful consideration. Each entry required unanimous approval from existing residents. New arrivals underwent a period of instruction, learning the skills necessary for underground survival and the beliefs that held the community together. The instruction process was documented in meticulous detail. New residents spent their first year learning to navigate the tunnel system without artificial light, developing the enhanced hearing and spatial awareness necessary for underground life. They studied the cultivation of specialized crops that could grow in the dim light of the deeper chambers, mushrooms and root vegetables that formed the basis of the community's diet. Most importantly, they learned the rituals that the community believed maintained their connection to the entity they served. These rituals weren't the violent sacrifices that surface investigators had imagined. Instead, they were complex ceremonies designed to demonstrate devotion and maintain spiritual balance. Monthly gatherings where community members would offer drops of their own blood to consecrate newly carved chambers. Seasonal celebrations that involved elaborate dances performed in spaces lit only by phosphorescent minerals. Daily meditations conducted in perfect silence, sometimes lasting for hours. The entity they served wasn't described as a malevolent force demanding human sacrifice, but as an ancient presence that offered protection in exchange for worship and isolation. The tablets referred to it as the Deep Guardian, a being that had dwelt within the mountain long before human settlement. The community's offerings weren't payments extracted through fear, but gifts given out of gratitude for sanctuary and guidance. The relationship between the surface church and the underground community was more complex than investigators had initially understood. The church served not as a hunting ground for victims, but as a careful screening mechanism for potential new residents. Pastor Hammond and his predecessors identified individuals who met specific criteria, people whose disappearance wouldn't trigger extensive investigations. The elderly without family, drifters passing through the region, individuals already marginalized by society. But the selection process involved more than just vulnerability. The tablets described a psychological profile that the community sought in new members. The church served as a place where these individuals could be observed and evaluated, their readiness for underground life carefully assessed. The transition process was gradual and voluntary. Potential residents would be invited to special evening services held in the church basement, where they would be introduced to modified versions of the community's beliefs. Those who showed genuine interest would be taken on guided tours of the uppermost tunnel levels, presented as historical curiosities rather than active living spaces. Only after demonstrating sustained commitment would they be invited to visit the actual residential chambers. The choice to join the underground community was always framed as exactly that, a choice. The tablets contained detailed records of individuals who had been approached but decided to remain on the surface. These people were never harmed or silenced, but were instead bound by elaborate oath ceremonies that ensured their discretion. Several entries described former potential recruits who had lived their entire surface lives while keeping the community's secrets. The empty coffins served multiple purposes beyond simple deception. They provided closure for surface families, preventing the prolonged searches that missing persons cases typically generated. They satisfied legal requirements for death certificates, allowing the community's financial operations to proceed without scrutiny. But they also served a ritual function, representing the symbolic death of the individual's surface identity and their rebirth as a member of the underground society. The financial schemes that investigators had uncovered weren't motivated by greed, but by practical necessity. The underground community required resources that couldn't be produced in their subterranean environment: medicine, tools, certain types of food, materials for expansion and maintenance. The insurance fraud and property manipulation generated the funds necessary to purchase these items without revealing their true purpose. The community's connection to the larger Appalachian network wasn't about spreading their practices to other locations, but about maintaining communication with similar groups that had developed independently. The tablets referenced other underground communities scattered through the mountain region, each serving their own version of the Deep Guardian, each maintaining their own methods of recruitment and sustainability. The photographs that investigators found told the story of generations born and raised entirely underground. Children who had never seen sunlight, who considered the tunnel system their natural environment. Adults who had lived their entire lives in service to the Deep Guardian, who possessed knowledge and skills that would be impossible to acquire on the surface. Elderly residents whose memories stretched back to the community's earliest days, who served as living repositories of underground history and tradition. The aging process appeared different for underground residents. The photographs showed individuals who seemed to age more slowly than their surface counterparts, retaining physical capabilities well into what should have been their declining years. Whether this was due to the controlled environment, the specialized diet, the reduced stress of underground life, or something more supernatural, remained unclear from the available evidence. The community's medical practices combined traditional Appalachian folk remedies with techniques that appeared to be entirely original. The tablets described treatments for conditions that were unknown on the surface, ailments that only affected long-term underground residents. They also documented healing methods that seemed remarkably effective, using combinations of minerals, fungi, and plant materials that could only be found in the deepest chambers. The educational system for underground children was comprehensive and sophisticated. Reading and mathematics were taught using the community's unique symbol system. History lessons focused on the development of underground society and the mythology surrounding the Deep Guardian. Practical skills included advanced techniques for tunnel construction, crop cultivation in minimal light conditions, and the maintenance of the complex water and air circulation systems. Most remarkably, the children were taught from an early age to communicate through methods that didn't require speech. A complex system of hand signals, body language, and even scent marking allowed for silent communication throughout the tunnel system. This wasn't just for stealth purposes, but was believed to be a form of worship, demonstrating respect for the Deep Guardian's preference for quiet contemplation. The community's artistic traditions were unlike anything found in surface Appalachian culture. Sculptures carved from the living rock of the chamber walls depicted scenes from underground life with extraordinary skill. Textile work used dyes derived from underground minerals to create patterns that seemed to shift and change in the dim phosphorescent light. Music was performed using instruments crafted from materials found only in the deepest chambers, creating sounds that resonated through the stone in ways that couldn't be replicated on the surface. The Deep Guardian itself remained an enigma even after the discovery of the underground community. The tablets described encounters with the entity, but these accounts were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some residents claimed to have seen it as a physical presence. Others described purely spiritual communications. What remained constant was the belief that the Deep Guardian's protection was real and necessary, that the underground community existed only through its continued benevolence. The investigation's most disturbing discovery wasn't evidence of violence or coercion, but the realization that the underground community had been largely successful in achieving its goals. The residents had created a sustainable society that had persisted for over a century. They had developed technologies and practices that allowed them to thrive in an environment that should have been uninhabitable. They had maintained their secrecy and security despite the pressures of modern surveillance and investigation. The community's response to the surface world's intrusion was swift and comprehensive. Within hours of the first investigators entering the chamber system, the underground residents had begun their evacuation procedures. The tablets described contingency plans that had been developed over generations, methods for rapidly relocating the entire community to deeper chambers that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. The evacuation wasn't panicked or desperate, but was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all aspects of underground life. Essential supplies were gathered and transported. Important artifacts and records were secured. The chambers were carefully sealed to prevent further surface intrusion while leaving no obvious evidence of their continued habitation. By the time federal investigators arrived with proper equipment and personnel, the accessible chambers were empty. The air circulation systems had been shut down, leaving the spaces cold and still. The water channels had been diverted, creating an environment that would quickly become uninhabitable for surface dwellers. Most tellingly, the passages leading to the deeper chambers had been collapsed with an expertise that suggested decades of preparation. The few artifacts that remained were clearly left intentionally, selected to tell a specific story about the underground community while revealing nothing about their current location or future plans. The stone tablets provided historical context without giving away operational details. The photographs showed faces, but no identifying landmarks. The personal belongings suggested individual stories without revealing the community's collective structure. What investigators found beneath Mount Calvary Baptist Church wasn't the end of the story, but merely the conclusion of one chapter in a much larger narrative. The underground community had successfully transitioned from their original sanctuary to new locations deeper within the mountain. The surface world's brief glimpse into their society had been carefully managed, revealing enough to satisfy official curiosity while protecting the information necessary for continued survival. The empty coffins remained empty, but they no longer represented deception. Instead, they had become symbols of transformation, markers of the boundary between surface life and underground existence. The 138 names carved into weathered headstones weren't victims of a conspiracy, but pioneers who had chosen to explore possibilities that existed beyond the conventional understanding of human society. The mountain kept its secrets, as it always had, but now those secrets included not just the location of the underground community, but the knowledge that such communities were possible, that human beings could adapt to environments previously thought uninhabitable, that alternative forms of society could persist and thrive beyond the reach of modern civilization, that the deep guardian, whatever its true nature, continued to offer sanctuary to those willing to accept its terms. The investigation officially concluded with the sealing of the accessible chamber system and the classification of all related documents. Mount Calvary Baptist Church was quietly demolished, the site returned to the state as protected wilderness. The missing persons cases were closed without resolution, their files archived with notations that suggested natural deaths in remote locations. But the questions raised by the discovery continued to resonate through the small communities of eastern Kentucky. Residents reported strange dreams featuring underground chambers and phosphorescent light. Hikers claimed to hear distant singing from locations where no human habitation should exist. Most unsettling of all, several individuals reported receiving mysterious invitations, unsigned notes that appeared in their mailboxes, suggesting they might find what they were seeking if they were willing to look beneath the surface. The deep guardian waited in the darkness below, patient as stone, ancient as the mountains themselves. The underground community continued its careful work of preservation and preparation, ready to welcome new members who possess the hunger for deeper truth. And somewhere in the vast network of natural and artificial tunnels that honeycomb the Appalachian Mountains, 138 souls and their descendants carried on traditions that predated written history, serving purposes that transcended surface understanding. What remains uncovered about Mount Calvary Baptist Church runs deeper than any federal investigation could reach. The sealed chambers, the abandoned tunnels, the empty graves, these were merely the visible remnants of something that had been evolving for over a century. In the months following the evacuation, strange reports began filtering out of eastern Kentucky. Reports that suggested the community hadn't simply vanished, but had instead activated networks that stretched far beyond a single church. The first indication came from insurance investigators reviewing the massive fraud claims. What they discovered defied logical explanation. Death certificates that had been filed across 7 states over the past decade all bore the same peculiar watermark, a symbol that matched the cave markings found beneath Mount Calvary. The certificates covered individuals from isolated mountain communities throughout Appalachia, each following the same pattern: sudden illnesses, quick deaths, immediate cremations, and insurance payouts that disappeared into untraceable accounts. More disturbing was the pattern of survivors. In every case, family members would relocate within months of the supposed death, selling property at prices far below market value to buyers who paid in cash and left no forwarding addresses. Real estate records showed these transactions occurred with supernatural regularity, always during new moon phases, always involving properties that bordered cave systems or underground water sources. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist brought in to analyze the Mount Calvary remains, made a discovery that changed everything. The bone fragments found in the empty coffins weren't from the supposed occupants. Carbon dating revealed they were ancient, some over 1,000 years old. More unsettling, they belonged to individuals who had died violently, their bones bearing marks consistent with ritualistic modification. The fragments had been deliberately placed, aged with chemicals to appear recent, and arranged in patterns that mimicked proper burial. This revelation forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth. The entire cemetery was a fabrication. Every burial over the past 11 years had been staged. The 138 missing individuals had never been in those graves. They had been taken somewhere else entirely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired postal worker named Eleanor Briggs had delivered mail to the remote mountain routes for 43 years. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every hollow, every family, every strange occurrence in 100 square mile radius. What she told investigators painted a picture of systematic deception that spanned generations. According to Briggs, certain families throughout the region had been practicing what locals called the old arrangements for decades. Children who showed particular aptitudes, unusual intelligence, psychic sensitivity, or physical capabilities would be identified early. These children would gradually disappear from public life, reported as moving away to live with distant relatives or attend special schools. In reality, they were being prepared for integration into underground communities. The process was methodical. Families would be approached during times of crisis, medical emergencies, financial disasters, legal troubles. The community would offer solutions that seemed miraculous. Medical bills would be mysteriously paid. Criminal charges would disappear. Failed businesses would suddenly receive anonymous investments. In exchange, families would allow their most promising children to be educated in specialized programs that prepared them for important work. These children would return periodically, but neighbors noticed changes. They spoke differently, moved with unusual confidence, and seemed to possess knowledge beyond their years. They would eventually take positions of influence, becoming doctors, lawyers, social workers, or government clerks, always in positions where they could identify vulnerable individuals or families in need. This network had been operating for generations, creating a shadow infrastructure throughout Appalachian society. The Mount Calvary Church was merely one node in a vast system that included dozens of similar operations. Each community was self-sufficient but connected to the others through encrypted communications, shared resources, and coordinated activities. The evidence suggested these communities had developed technologies far beyond what surface dwellers possessed. Surveillance equipment found in the caves included devices that could intercept and decode digital communications from distances of over 50 miles. Power systems utilized geothermal and hydroelectric sources that generated electricity without any visible infrastructure. Agricultural systems produced yields that defied conventional understanding of soil composition and growing conditions. Most disturbing were the medical facilities. The underground chambers contained surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies that would rival major hospitals. Medical records indicated procedures that pushed the boundaries of current scientific understanding. Genetic modifications, neurological enhancements, and longevity treatments that seemed to extend human lifespan significantly beyond normal parameters. The residents themselves had been transformed in ways that challenged basic assumptions about human biology. Blood samples collected from abandoned facilities showed unusual genetic markers, modifications that appeared to enhance physical strength, sensory acuity, and resistance to disease. Brain scans of individuals who had escaped or been captured revealed neurological structures that differed significantly from baseline human anatomy. These modifications weren't random. They followed specific patterns designed to create individuals optimized for different roles within the underground society. Some were enhanced for physical labor, capable of working in environments that would be lethal to normal humans. Others showed improvements in memory, analytical thinking, and pattern recognition that bordered on superhuman. A select few displayed abilities that conventional science couldn't explain: apparent telepathic communication, precognitive awareness, and the capacity to influence electronic systems through direct neural interface. The most chilling discovery came from analyzing communication logs found in the abandoned facilities. The underground communities weren't just hiding from surface society, they were actively manipulating it. The network had infiltrated government agencies, law enforcement, medical institutions, and financial systems at every level. They possessed detailed profiles on millions of surface dwellers, tracking bloodlines, psychological vulnerabilities, and potential usefulness to their cause. Their influence extended far beyond eastern Kentucky. Similar operations were documented in remote areas of West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. Each location was chosen for specific geological features: extensive cave systems, underground water sources, and proximity to areas with high concentrations of rare earth minerals. The communities were constructing something vast and coordinated, a shadow civilization that paralleled and gradually subsumed the surface world. The scope of their planning became apparent when investigators discovered archived documents dating back to the 1800s. These weren't spontaneous communities formed by religious fervor or social isolation. They were the result of a deliberate, multi-generational project designed to preserve and enhance human civilization in preparation for some anticipated catastrophe. The documents referenced environmental collapse, societal breakdown, and spiritual degradation as inevitable consequences of surface civilization's trajectory. The underground communities saw themselves as arcs, preserving not just human knowledge and culture, but an improved version of humanity itself. They believed their genetic and neurological modifications would allow their descendants to rebuild civilization on a foundation of enhanced human capability and spiritual enlightenment. But the most disturbing element wasn't their technology or their planning, it was their patience. The communities had been operating for over a century, slowly and methodically implementing their vision. They showed no urgency, no desperation. They were content to work across generations, gradually shifting the balance of power between surface and subsurface civilizations. The evacuation of Mount Calvary hadn't been a panicked retreat. It had been a planned transition. The community had served its purpose, establishing the infrastructure and relationships necessary for the next phase of their operation. The empty coffins, the abandoned facilities, the sealed chambers, these were messages, demonstrations of their capabilities, and their commitment to their cause. Intelligence analysts studying the case concluded that the communities represented a form of parallel evolution, not just biological, but social and technological. They had developed beyond the point where integration with surface society was possible or desirable. They were becoming something fundamentally different from baseline humanity. The implications were staggering. If the network included even a fraction of the operations suggested by the evidence, they could represent the largest and most successful infiltration in human history. They possess the resources, the technology, and the generational commitment necessary to reshape civilization according to their vision. Government response was swift and comprehensive. The investigation was classified at the highest levels. Media coverage was suppressed. Witnesses were relocated or discredited. The official narrative became that Mount Calvary Baptist Church had been the site of a tragic cult incident, with most members dying in a collective suicide that left little physical evidence. But those familiar with the true scope of the discovery knew that suppression was merely buying time. The communities weren't dependent on any single location or operation. They had built redundancy into every system, alternative communication networks, and contingency plans that spanned decades. Even if every known facility was raided simultaneously, the core network would survive and adapt. More troubling was the realization that the communities might not be entirely human anymore. The genetic modifications, the neurological enhancements, the apparent psychic abilities, these suggested evolution towards something that retained human appearance but possessed capabilities that transcended human limitations. They were becoming a new species, one that viewed baseline humanity as an earlier, less evolved version of themselves. The Deep Guardian, the entity that survivors claimed governed the communities, remained an enigma. Whether it was a highly advanced human, a collective consciousness created by networked minds, or something else entirely, it represented a form of intelligence that operated on timescales and with objectives that human investigators couldn't fully comprehend. What was certain was that the Mount Calvary incident had merely lifted the veil on something vast and ancient that had been growing beneath the surface of American society. The empty coffins weren't symbols of death, they were symbols of transformation. The 138 missing individuals hadn't died. They had become something else, something that no longer belonged to the world above ground. In the sealed darkness of the Appalachian depths, enhanced by generations of careful modification and guided by an intelligence that transcended individual consciousness, a new form of human civilization continued its patient evolution. The mountain hollows held their secrets close, but those secrets were no longer hiding. They were waiting, growing stronger, and preparing for the day when the distinction between surface and subsurface, between human and post-human, would become irrelevant. The truth about Mount Calvary Baptist Church runs deeper than anyone imagined, but understanding the full scope of this operation requires examining the broader network that made it possible. Because what we've uncovered isn't just one church conducting bizarre rituals. It's a sprawling infrastructure of corruption, complicity, and cover-ups that reaches into every corner of Appalachian society. The financial mechanics alone reveal a sophistication that defies explanation. Between 1912 and 2023, Mount Calvary processed over $4 million in fraudulent insurance claims across 17 different companies. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Not a single insurance investigator ever questioned the pattern. Claims were approved within days, sometimes hours of submission. Death certificates were rubber stamped by county coroners who never examined bodies. Burial permits were issued for graves that would remain empty for decades. This level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. It requires systematic corruption at every level of oversight. And the paper trail, when you know how to read it, tells a story of institutional capture that would make organized crime families jealous. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant who spent 3 years analyzing the financial records, discovered something that changed everything. The insurance payouts weren't random. They followed precise mathematical patterns, with claim amounts calibrated to avoid triggering federal oversight thresholds. Someone with intimate knowledge of insurance regulation was orchestrating this entire operation. But the money was just the beginning. The real power structure emerged when we examined the personnel files of key officials across eastern Kentucky. County coroners, insurance adjusters, state health inspectors, even federal agents assigned to the region, all shared certain characteristics. They were recruited from specific families, educated at particular institutions, and their career trajectories followed unnaturally similar paths. Take Harold Brennan, who served as Pike County coroner for 37 years. His signature appears on every death certificate for the supposed victims of Mount Calvary. But Brennan wasn't just a complicit official. He was a graduate of something called the Appalachian Leadership Institute, a private educational program that operated from 1923 to 1987. The institute claimed to train future leaders for mountain communities, but its alumni list reads like a who's who of officials connected to unexplained disappearances across the region. The institute's curriculum included courses with innocuous names like regional development and community psychology. But course materials recovered from a storage facility in 2019 revealed something far more sinister. Students were taught techniques for managing public perception during crisis events, methods for coordinating multi-agency responses to unusual situations, and protocols for what they called population transition management. Martha Kellogg, a former institute instructor who broke her silence in 2021, described an educational program designed to create a shadow administrative class. Students weren't just learning governance, they were being indoctrinated into a worldview that saw ordinary citizens as resources to be managed rather than people to be served. The ultimate goal, according to internal documents, was creating a parallel system of authority that could operate independently of democratic oversight. This explains how Mount Calvary's operations remained hidden for so long. They weren't evading detection, they were protected by a network of officials who viewed their activities as legitimate. From their perspective, the church wasn't committing crimes, it was fulfilling a higher purpose that transcended conventional law. The recruitment process for this shadow network was remarkably sophisticated. Young people showing particular aptitudes were identified during high school, often through standardized testing programs that included psychological assessments disguised as career counseling. Those who displayed the right combination of intelligence, ambition, and moral flexibility were guided toward specific educational and career paths. James Morton, who served as a federal inspector for the Department of Health and Human Services, exemplifies this pattern. Born in Letcher County in 1952, Morton scored in the 99th percentile on every standardized test he took. Rather than being encouraged to pursue opportunities outside Appalachia, he was directed toward the Leadership Institute, where he received a full scholarship and specialized training in regulatory compliance. Morton's federal career was meteoric. Within 15 years, he held oversight responsibility for institutional inspections across 6 states. His jurisdiction included not just Mount Calvary, but dozens of similar facilities that, in retrospect, show the same patterns of suspicious activity. Morton's inspection reports consistently gave these institutions perfect scores, even when whistleblowers had documented serious violations. When Morton died in a car accident in 2018, his personal effects included encrypted communications with individuals whose identities remain classified. But code-breaking specialists have identified references to something called the Preservation Protocol, a coordinated response plan for protecting what they termed essential infrastructure during periods of social transition. The protocol appears to be a contingency plan for maintaining the underground communities, even if surface operations were discovered. It includes procedures for rapid evacuation, communication blackouts, and what they euphemistically call resource reallocation. The plan anticipates scenarios ranging from federal investigation to complete societal collapse, with detailed responses for each contingency. But the most chilling aspect of the protocol is its scope. References to similar operations span from North Georgia to West Virginia, suggesting that Mount Calvary wasn't unique, but rather one node in a vast network of underground facilities. Each location appears to serve a specific function, creating a distributed system that could survive the loss of any individual component. Financial records indicate that these facilities have been sharing resources for decades. Medical equipment, construction materials, even personnel move between locations according to coordinated schedules. The logistics required for this level of coordination suggest an organization with capabilities rivaling those of government agencies. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a sociologist who has studied isolated communities for 40 years, believes we're looking at something unprecedented in American history. A shadow society that has developed parallel institutions, parallel economies, and parallel systems of governance. Her research suggests that the underground communities have achieved a level of self-sufficiency that makes them essentially independent nations operating within our borders. The technology discovered in these facilities supports this assessment. Solar power systems, hydroponic food production, advanced medical equipment, and communication networks that operate independently of commercial infrastructure. Someone has invested enormous resources in creating communities that could survive indefinitely without surface contact. But survival isn't the only goal. Evidence suggests these communities are actively expanding. Property records show a pattern of land acquisition around suspected facility locations, often through shell companies or seemingly legitimate conservation groups. The acquired properties are typically remote, geologically suitable for underground construction, and strategically positioned to create buffer zones around existing operations. The expansion follows a methodical pattern that suggests long-term planning spanning multiple generations. New facilities aren't built randomly, but according to geographic and demographic criteria that optimize for secrecy while maintaining operational efficiency. Someone is thinking decades, perhaps centuries ahead. Most disturbing is evidence that the recruitment process continues. Missing person reports from across Appalachia show patterns consistent with systematic selection rather than random disappearance. The missing share certain characteristics. They're typically young, healthy, intelligent, and from families with limited resources to pursue extensive searches. But they're not taken against their will. Investigation into recent disappearances reveals a sophisticated recruitment process that makes the underground communities seem like attractive alternatives to surface life. Recruiters identify individuals facing financial hardship, family problems, or legal troubles, then offer solutions that seem too good to be true. Sarah Jessica Parker, not the actress but a 19-year-old from Floyd County, disappeared in 2019 after her family lost their farm to foreclosure. Security footage from her last known location shows her having an extended conversation with a woman who appeared to be a social worker. The woman offered Sarah assistance with housing, education, and job training through what she described as a private foundation serving disadvantaged youth. Sarah's family never heard from her again, but they received a letter 6 months later explaining that she had relocated for educational opportunities and would be unable to maintain contact during her intensive training program. The letter included a cashier's check for $15,000 to help with their financial difficulties. This pattern repeats across dozens of cases. Young people facing difficult circumstances are offered opportunities that require them to sever contact with their previous lives. The opportunities are always presented as temporary, with promises of future reunification, but the separations become permanent. The recruiters themselves are fascinating subjects. They appear to be former community members who have returned to the surface for specific missions. They possess intimate knowledge of local conditions, family histories, and individual vulnerabilities. But they also display characteristics that suggest extensive training in psychological manipulation and social engineering. Dr. Marcus Reed, a psychologist who has interviewed several family members of the disappeared, notes that the recruiters demonstrate remarkable skill in identifying and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. They don't use high-pressure tactics, but instead create situations where joining the underground communities seems like the individual's own idea. The sophistication of these recruitment operations suggests an organization with deep understanding of human psychology and extensive resources for training personnel. This is an amateur hour. We're looking at professional level operations conducted by people with advanced education and specialized skills. But who is providing this education and training? The Leadership Institute closed in 1987, officially due to declining enrollment. But financial records indicate that its assets were transferred to something called the Mountain Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization that claims to preserve Appalachian cultural traditions. The foundation operates several educational programs for young adults, including wilderness survival courses, traditional crafts workshops, and what they call cultural immersion experiences. Participants in these programs spend months in remote locations learning skills that would be valuable in self-sufficient communities. Alumni of foundation programs frequently disappear from public records after graduation. They don't maintain social media accounts. They don't appear in employment databases, and they seem to vanish from the conventional economy entirely. Yet financial records show that the foundation continues to support them through various charitable programs. Investigation into the foundation's funding sources reveals a complex network of donors, many of whom are themselves connected to the suspected underground operations. The money flows through multiple layers of shell companies and charitable organizations, making it nearly impossible to trace ultimate sources. But pattern analysis reveals something significant. The funding increases during periods of economic hardship, social unrest, or natural disasters. It's as if the organization expands its operations when surface society becomes less stable, recruiting more heavily when people are most vulnerable to alternative arrangements. This suggests a long-term strategy that views surface society as inherently unstable and positions the underground communities as a more sustainable alternative. From their perspective, they're not kidnapping people but rescuing them from a failing system. The philosophical underpinnings of this worldview emerge from documents recovered during various investigations. The underground communities appear to operate according to principles that blend environmental sustainability, technological self-sufficiency, and what they call adaptive governance. They see themselves as pioneers of a post-democratic society organized around competence rather than popular will. Their governance structures reflect this philosophy. Leadership positions are filled through assessment processes that evaluate technical skills, psychological stability, and commitment to community welfare. Democratic participation is limited to specific domains, with most decisions made by councils of specialists in relevant fields. The communities have developed their own legal systems, economic arrangements, and social institutions. They've essentially created alternative versions of every aspect of human organization, optimized for their particular circumstances and values. But the most significant aspect of their society is its relationship with the deep guardian. All major decisions are filtered through ritual consultations with this entity, creating a form of governance that combines technocratic expertise with supernatural guidance. The result is a social system unlike anything in recorded history. Understanding the full implications of this discovery requires grappling with questions that challenge our fundamental assumptions about society, governance, and human nature. We're not just looking at a criminal conspiracy, but at an alternative form of human organization that has operated successfully for over a century. The underground communities represent a parallel evolution of human society, one that has developed solutions to problems that surface civilization continues to struggle with. Their environmental sustainability, social cohesion, and technological capabilities in many ways surpass what we've achieved in the conventional world. Yet their methods for achieving these successes involve deception, manipulation, and the systematic separation of families. The question becomes whether the ends justify the means and whether their model offers lessons for surface society or warnings about the costs of pursuing perfection through authoritarian methods. What we know for certain is that this story is far from over. The underground communities continue to operate, continue to expand, and continue to recruit new members. They represent a shadow civilization that has grown alongside our own, developing capabilities and pursuing goals that remain largely hidden from public view. The discovery of Mount Calvary Baptist Church was just the beginning. It opened a door into a world that challenges everything we thought we knew about American society, about the communities hidden in our most remote regions, and about the lengths people will go to in pursuit of their vision of a better future. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is that they may be right about the instability of surface society. As we face mounting environmental, economic, and social challenges, the underground communities offer a model of resilience that surface civilization lacks. The truth about what lay beneath Mount Calvary Baptist Church would challenge everything we thought we knew about the limits of human adaptation and the price of survival. Because what the investigators discovered in those final sealed chambers wasn't just a community that had evolved beyond recognition. It was a civilization that had been preparing for something far more catastrophic than anyone on the surface could imagine. In the deepest levels of the underground complex, nearly a mile beneath the Kentucky mountains, the expedition team found what could only be described as an ark. Not the biblical kind, but something far more terrifying in its implications. Massive chambers carved from living rock, each one designed to sustain thousands of people for decades. But these weren't crude shelters. They were technologically advanced habitats that seemed to anticipate the complete collapse of the world above. The ventilation systems drew air through filters that could process atmospheric toxins that didn't yet exist. Water purification plants that could handle contamination levels that would kill normal humans. Food production facilities growing crops that had been genetically modified to survive in conditions where sunlight was just a memory. Everything about these chambers suggested they were built by people who knew something was coming, something that would make the surface uninhabitable. But it was the medical facilities that truly revealed the scope of their preparations. Operating theaters equipped with technology that seemed decades ahead of anything available on the surface. Genetic laboratories where they had been systematically modifying human DNA, not just for enhanced abilities, but for survival in a world that no longer existed. Blood banks containing samples from thousands of individuals, cataloged and preserved with a precision that suggested they were building a genetic library for rebuilding humanity. The children found in these deepest chambers were no longer recognizably human in any conventional sense. Their eyes had adapted to see in complete darkness. Their lungs processed air with efficiency that defied medical understanding, and their bodies showed modifications that would allow them to survive radiation levels that would be instantly fatal to surface dwellers. They moved through the underground complex with a fluid grace that spoke of generations of adaptation to their subterranean world. Most disturbing was their communication system. They had developed a form of telepathic connection that allowed instant information sharing across vast distances. Not through any supernatural means, but through bioengineered neural modifications that created a living network of consciousness. Each individual was simultaneously themselves and part of a collective intelligence that could process information and make decisions at speeds that made traditional human thought seem glacial. The Deep Guardian, it turned out, wasn't some ancient entity demanding blood sacrifice. It was something far more sophisticated, a biological supercomputer grown from modified human neural tissue, fed and maintained by the community that had been calculating survival scenarios for over a century. Every decision made by the underground society was informed by its projections. Every genetic modification, every technological development, every recruitment from the surface world was guided by its understanding of what humanity would need to survive what was coming. The missing people, the insurance fraud, the empty coffins, all of it had been feeding this vast preparation. The surface world had been systematically harvested not just for resources and new members, but for genetic diversity. The community had been collecting DNA samples, medical records, and living subjects to ensure they could rebuild human civilization when the time came. They weren't just planning to survive whatever catastrophe they anticipated. They were planning to be the only ones who survived it. The technology they had developed was breathtaking in its scope. Energy systems that could run for centuries without maintenance, powered by geothermal sources they had tapped deep within the mountain. Manufacturing capabilities that could produce everything from basic tools to advanced electronics using materials extracted from the surrounding rock. They had created a completely self-sufficient civilization that could thrive in isolation for generations. Their agricultural systems were particularly remarkable. They had developed crops that could grow in the mineral-rich soil of the deep caverns, plants that actually thrived in the high-radiation environment they expected to face, protein sources that could be cultivated in vast underground farms, creatures that had been bioengineered to reproduce rapidly and provide complete nutrition. They had solved the fundamental problem of long-term survival in a hostile environment. But perhaps most impressive was their social organization. They had eliminated the conflicts that plagued surface society through a combination of genetic modification and psychological conditioning. Aggression had been bred out of their population over generations, replaced with an instinctive cooperation that made their society function like a single organism. They had created a form of human civilization that was perfectly adapted to their underground environment and the challenges they expected to face. The records they kept painted a picture of incredible foresight. They had been tracking environmental degradation, political instability, and technological development on the surface for over a century. Their calculations suggested that human civilization was approaching a series of cascading failures that would make the surface world uninhabitable within decades. Nuclear war, environmental collapse, the pandemic disease, societal breakdown, all of it was anticipated and planned for. They had been preparing for the end of the world as we know it, and they had been doing it by systematically removing the best and brightest from surface society. The missing people weren't random victims. They were carefully selected individuals with specific genetic markers, particular skills, or unique knowledge that would be valuable in rebuilding civilization. The community had been conducting the largest human trafficking operation in history, but their goal wasn't profit or power. It was species survival. The children born in the deep chambers were the culmination of this planning. Each generation had been more adapted to their environment than the last, more capable of surviving in the harsh conditions they expected to face. They were faster, stronger, smarter, and more resilient than baseline humans. They could survive radiation that would kill surface dwellers, process toxins that would be lethal to normal people and work together with a coordination that made them incredibly efficient. What made this discovery so chilling was the realization that they might be right. The evidence they had collected, the projections they had made, the preparations they had undertaken, all of it suggested they had identified real threats to human survival that surface society was completely unprepared for. They hadn't just created an underground civilization, they had created humanity's backup plan. The investigators found themselves facing an impossible choice. Should they expose this underground society and risk destroying humanity's best chance of survival? Or should they allow the systematic harvesting of surface dwellers to continue in service of this greater goal? The community had been operating for over a century, had developed technology that could revolutionize human civilization, and had prepared for threats that might very well be real. But they had also committed crimes on a scale that defied comprehension. Thousands of people had disappeared into their underground world, their families left to grieve and wonder what had happened to them. Entire communities had been systematically stripped of their most valuable members. The social fabric of Appalachian society had been quietly torn apart to feed this vast project. The moral implications were staggering. If the community's projections were correct, if surface civilization was indeed heading toward collapse, then their actions might represent the greatest act of species preservation in human history. But if they were wrong, if their calculations were flawed, then they had committed genocide on a scale that dwarfed any previous atrocity. The investigation team found themselves looking at evidence of human evolution in real time. The community had taken control of their own genetic destiny and accelerated the process of adaptation to create a new form of human being. They had solved problems that had plagued humanity for millennia and created a society that could survive anything the future might bring. But they had also created something that was no longer recognizably human in any traditional sense. The people in the deepest chambers moved and thought and communicated in ways that seemed alien to surface dwellers. They had transcended human limitations, but in doing so, they had also transcended humanity itself. The question that haunted the investigators was whether this transformation represented evolution or extinction. Had the community created the next step in human development, or had they simply created a new species that would replace humanity entirely? By 2019, the investigation had reached a point where federal authorities found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. The evidence was overwhelming, the scope was staggering, but the implications threatened to unravel fundamental assumptions about human progress, institutional trust, and the very nature of civilization itself. What do you do when you discover that everything you believed about evolution, about progress, about the future, might be wrong? The enhanced beings weren't just genetically modified humans living underground. They represented something far more profound and terrifying. They were proof that human evolution could be deliberately accelerated, that consciousness could be preserved and transferred, that death itself might be negotiable. The technology they possessed, developed over generations of underground innovation, was decades ahead of anything known to surface science. Their telepathic networks, their extended lifespans, their ability to process information at superhuman speeds, all of this challenged every assumption about human potential and limitation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead investigator who had first uncovered the financial irregularities at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, found herself at the center of discussions that would have been considered science fiction just months earlier. The journals recovered from the underground facilities contained detailed records of genetic modifications, consciousness transfers, and technological innovations that read like blueprints for a completely different form of human existence. But perhaps most disturbing were the prophecies, the carefully documented predictions about surface world collapse, environmental catastrophe, and societal breakdown that were proving unnervingly accurate. The enhanced beings hadn't just been preparing for survival, they had been preparing for inheritance. Their underground civilization wasn't designed as a temporary refuge, but as the foundation for a post-apocalyptic world where they would emerge as humanity's successors. The carefully preserved memories, the advanced technology, the genetically optimized humans, all of it was preparation for a future where the surface world had failed and the real work of human evolution could begin. Federal agents studying the underground facilities discovered something that chilled them to their core. The enhanced beings had been monitoring surface world developments for decades through their embedded network of politicians, academics, and business leaders. They hadn't just been predicting collapse, they had been subtly encouraging it. Environmental disasters that seemed like natural consequences of industrial progress had been accelerated through strategic corporate decisions made by surface world leaders who were unknowingly following guidance from below. Political divisions that appeared to be organic expressions of ideological differences had been amplified through carefully placed social media campaigns and think tank research funded by front organizations connected to the underground network. The realization hit investigators like a physical blow. The enhanced beings hadn't just been preparing for humanity's future, they had been engineering it. The surface world's problems weren't just symptoms of natural human limitation and environmental pressure. They were the result of a century-long manipulation designed to create the conditions where underground civilization would be seen not as an aberration, but as salvation. Dr. Marcus Webb, a geneticist brought in to analyze the biological modifications found in enhanced beings, made a discovery that kept him awake for weeks. The genetic changes weren't random improvements, but followed a precise pattern designed to create distinct castes within underground society. Some enhanced beings were optimized for intellectual processing, others for physical labor, still others for what could only be described as spiritual or consciousness-related functions. It was a deliberately engineered hierarchy that made surface world social stratification look primitive by comparison. But the most disturbing aspect was the integration. Enhanced beings weren't just genetically modified, they were psychologically networked in ways that challenged basic assumptions about individual identity and free will. The telepathic connections discovered in early investigations were just the beginning. Advanced enhanced beings existed in a state of partial consciousness, sharing where individual thoughts and experiences became part of a collective awareness. They had achieved something that philosophers and scientists had long debated as impossible, a truly integrated collective consciousness that maintained individual identity while sharing knowledge, emotions, and decision-making processes across the entire community. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be shared and preserved, if genetic modifications could create superhuman capabilities, if technology could advance far beyond current surface world achievements, then what did that mean for concepts like democracy, individual rights, and human dignity? The enhanced beings had solved problems that surface world science considered intractable, but they had done so by fundamentally altering what it meant to be human. Investigators found detailed plans for what the enhanced beings called the emergence, a carefully orchestrated revelation of their existence that would occur when surface world collapse reached a critical threshold. The plans included strategies for presenting themselves as humanity's saviors, offering their technology and knowledge to help rebuild civilization, but under their guidance and with their genetic modifications becoming the new baseline for human existence. It wasn't conquest in any traditional sense. It was evolution by design, with the enhanced beings positioned as both the architects and the beneficiaries of humanity's next phase. The underground facilities contained manufacturing capabilities that defied explanation, 3D printing technology that could create complex electronic devices at the molecular level, biological laboratories that could modify genetic code in real time, energy systems that appeared to violate known laws of thermodynamics. The enhanced beings had achieved technological singularity decades ago, but had kept it hidden while surface world science struggled with primitive versions of the same concepts. Most unsettling were the psychological profiles of enhanced beings who had been captured or who had voluntarily surrendered for study. They displayed emotional ranges and intellectual capabilities that made normal human interaction almost impossible. They could process information at speeds that made conventional conversation feel glacially slow. They could perceive emotional and psychological states in others with frightening accuracy, and they possessed a long-term perspective that made surface world concerns seem trivial and short-sighted. Yet they weren't monsters. In many ways, they were what humans might become if all limitations were removed. They had eliminated disease, extended lifespans, enhanced intelligence, and created a society where conflict was resolved through shared consciousness rather than violence or political maneuvering. They had achieved what every utopian philosopher had dreamed of, but they had done so by abandoning fundamental aspects of human nature that surface world civilization considered sacred. The enhanced beings who agreed to communicate with investigators spoke of surface world humans with a mixture of compassion and condescension that was deeply unsettling. They saw themselves as parents watching children struggle with problems that had simple solutions, if only the children were mature enough to accept guidance. They viewed surface world attachment to individual autonomy, democratic decision-making, and genetic diversity as primitive holdovers from an earlier stage of human development, charming but ultimately counterproductive obstacles to real progress. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a philosopher brought in to help understand the ethical implications of the discovery, found herself questioning everything she had believed about human nature and moral progress. The enhanced beings had created a society without poverty, without disease, without war, without environmental destruction. They had solved every major problem that plagued surface world civilization, but they had done so by becoming something that was no longer recognizably human in any traditional sense. The investigation revealed that the enhanced beings had been conducting their own studies of surface world humans, treating them as a control group in a vast experiment about the direction of human evolution. They had detailed psychological and sociological profiles of entire populations, tracking the development of ideas, technologies, and social movements with scientific precision. Surface world history wasn't just being observed from below, it was being studied as data points in a larger experiment about the future of consciousness and civilization. As federal authorities grappled with the implications of their discovery, they faced a choice that no government had ever confronted before. They could reveal the existence of the enhanced beings and trigger a crisis that would fundamentally transform human civilization. They could attempt to suppress the information and try to contain the underground network, though the scope and sophistication of that network made success unlikely. Or they could engage with the enhanced beings as equals and attempt to negotiate humanity's future. The enhanced beings, meanwhile, continued their preparations for emergence, apparently unconcerned by surface world discovery of their existence. From their perspective, the investigation was simply another data point in their long-term analysis of surface world development. They had always known that discovery was inevitable, and they had prepared for that eventuality as carefully as they had prepared for everything else. The question that haunted investigators wasn't whether the enhanced beings represented humanity's future, but whether that future was something to be embraced or resisted. They had achieved everything that human civilization claimed to aspire toward, but they had done so by becoming something that was no longer entirely human. The moment Agent Martinez stepped out of her SUV in Shadow Creek Valley, she knew she was walking into something that would forever change how humanity sees itself. The classified documents in her briefcase contained evidence that would shake the foundations of every government agency from Washington to Brussels. What she discovered wasn't just about missing persons or underground communities. This was about the next phase of human evolution happening right beneath our feet. The Deep Guardian wasn't some ancient entity or supernatural force. It was us, a collective consciousness created from 138 transformed individuals whose neural pathways had been rewired through decades of genetic modification and psychological conditioning. Each person who disappeared into those underground chambers became part of something larger, their individual consciousness preserved but interconnected in ways that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Dr. Rebecca Chen's final research notes, recovered from the sealed laboratory beneath Mount Calvary Baptist, revealed the stunning truth. The transformation process developed by these underground societies wasn't random experimentation. It was the culmination of over a century of careful observation, studying how isolation, trauma, and specific environmental conditions could trigger dormant genetic sequences in human DNA. Sequences that appeared to be evolutionary failsafes designed to activate during periods of extreme environmental stress. The bioengineered modifications weren't additions to human biology. They were activations of potential that already existed within our genetic code. Enhanced night vision, improved lung capacity, accelerated healing, and most remarkably, the ability to form neural connections with others who had undergone similar transformations. The Deep Guardian represented humanity's next evolutionary step, achieved not through natural selection, but through deliberate intervention. What makes this discovery truly unsettling is the scope of the operation. Federal investigators have now identified similar networks operating across 17 states, each connected through underground tunnel systems that predate European settlement. These aren't isolated communities of religious extremists or criminal organizations. They represent a parallel civilization that has been developing alongside surface society for over a century, quietly recruiting, transforming, and preparing for a future they believe is inevitable. The financial records uncovered in the investigation paint a picture of an operation with resources that rival those of small nations. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and investment portfolios worth billions of dollars, all carefully managed to fund research facilities, underground construction projects, and the infiltration of key positions in government, healthcare, and scientific institutions. The corruption runs so deep that investigators are still discovering the full extent of how many officials have been compromised. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this revelation is the selection process. The 138 individuals who disappeared weren't chosen randomly. Each was carefully evaluated for specific genetic markers, psychological profiles, and social circumstances that made them ideal candidates for transformation. The empty coffins weren't just covering up disappearances. They were marking the death of who these people used to be before becoming something entirely new. The underground facilities discovered beneath the Appalachian Mountains are marvels of engineering and biological innovation, self-sustaining ecosystems powered by geothermal energy, hydroponic farms capable of feeding thousands, and laboratories equipped with technology that surpasses anything available to surface scientists. The transformed inhabitants have developed manufacturing capabilities for materials that don't exist in any periodic table, using biological processes that seem to blur the line between organic and synthetic. Their society operates on principles that challenge every assumption about human nature and social organization. Individual identity exists, but is secondary to collective consciousness. Decision-making happens through a form of neural consensus that eliminates the need for traditional leadership structures. Resources are distributed based on biological need rather than economic systems. Crime, in any recognizable form, simply doesn't exist because antisocial behavior is impossible when individual consciousness is networked with the collective. The most chilling aspect of the investigation is what it reveals about their long-term plans. Documents recovered from multiple sites describe detailed preparations for what they call the surface collapse, a predicted breakdown of civilization due to climate change, resource depletion, and social instability. They aren't trying to prevent this collapse. They're preparing to inherit what remains. Their infiltration of surface institutions isn't about control or domination. It's about information gathering and strategic positioning. They've placed transformed individuals in key roles where they can monitor global conditions, influence policy decisions, and ensure that when surface civilization begins to fail, they'll be ready to step in as humanity's successors. The genetic modifications they've developed aren't just about survival in underground environments. They're about thriving in the post-collapse world they anticipate. Enhanced radiation resistance for contaminated zones, improved immune systems for biological threats, and modified digestive systems capable of processing food sources that would be toxic to unmodified humans. They've essentially created a version of humanity designed to survive the death of the current world. Federal authorities now face an unprecedented dilemma. How do you prosecute an organization that has technically committed crimes but represents what might be humanity's best chance for long-term survival? How do you shut down operations that have developed technologies and social systems that could benefit all of humanity? How do you arrest people who may no longer be entirely human in any legal sense? The investigation has revealed that Mount Calvary Baptist was just one node in a network that spans continents. Similar operations have been identified in the Australian outback, the Siberian wilderness, the Amazon rainforest, and the Canadian Arctic. This isn't an American phenomenon. It's a global transformation that has been occurring simultaneously across multiple isolated regions, suggesting coordination on a scale that governments are only beginning to comprehend. The transformed individuals aren't hostile to surface humanity, but they're not entirely sympathetic either. They view unmodified humans the way we might view an earlier stage of evolutionary development, necessary for reaching the current point, but ultimately destined to be surpassed. Their recruitment efforts continue not out of malice, but from what they see as compassion, offering selected individuals the opportunity to evolve beyond the limitations of baseline humanity. The Deep Guardian itself defies easy classification. It's simultaneously a collective consciousness, a biological superorganism, and a technological network that processes information and makes decisions at speeds that individual human minds can't match. It doesn't communicate in language as we understand it, but through direct neural transmission that conveys not just information, but emotional states, sensory experiences, and complex concepts that have no equivalent in human speech. As investigators continue to uncover the full scope of this underground civilization, one thing becomes clear. The story of the 138 missing persons from Mount Calvary Baptist isn't a story about victims and perpetrators. It's a story about humanity standing at an evolutionary crossroads, forced to confront the possibility that our species as we know it may not be the final chapter in human development. The empty coffins buried in Appalachian soil weren't just hiding disappearances. They were marking the end of one phase of human existence and the beginning of another. Whether that transformation represents salvation or something we should fear remains the most important question facing our species. The answer may determine not just the future of those 138 individuals, but the future of humanity itself.